Hello, everyone. This is Whitney Will from Star Hearth Astrology, and I'm here today to talk about the week ahead. This is the week of July 22nd through the 28th, and some of the stuff going on here. First and foremost, my forecast last week, I talked about how I expected Biden to drop out on Sunday or Monday, given the sun's trine with Neptune, Mercury square with Uranus, and then Monday, the sun entering Leo and immediately running into an opposition with Pluto. So we have huge transfers of power, huge monumental announcements. We will see what is happening as this election season just continues to be a wild one. We also have the week after the Republican National Convention announcing J.D. Vance as the Republican VP nominee. He is a Leo, and we like Leos. We like electing. Obama is a Leo, Trump is a Leo rising. We got a lot of Leo stuff going on. We don't have a birth time for J.D. Vance, but his birthday is August 4th. That means the sun is in Leo. The presumptive, probably Democratic nominee, Kamala Harris, has her Mars at 21 degrees of Leo opposite Saturn in Aquarius. So we will see. We will see if that is enough. She is a Gemini rising. She is about to turn 60 in October, bringing her into a first house year. Jupiter is in Gemini in her first house right now, while Saturn is transiting her 10th house. So it'll be interesting to see how those Saturn-Jupiter squares play out over the course of that. We will see. We also have Mars last weekend entering Gemini, and the big story of Mars in Gemini, and I think we'll see this play out in social media, as Gemini likes to be in that space and discussing in that space, is Mars building towards a conjunction with Jupiter and also a square with Saturn. So there's a lot of tension in that. There's also a lot of enthusiasm. We are all throwing around words and opinions, right? Mars weaponizes what it touches if it needs to. And in Gemini, Mars uses words as weapons and ideas as weapons, right? It's going to come up against the square with Saturn and Pisces. I'm sure we're going to see some issues with AI, fake news, what's real, what's not real. That's already hugely problematic. And so we will see how that builds throughout August. We also have Mercury in the shadow of its upcoming retrograde. And I think that this is really interesting because Mercury entered the shadow on Tuesday. Of course, then we had Mercury approaching that square with Uranus, which shut down all of the flights in the country, among other things, shut down a lot of big systems because there was a bug. I imagine that it will take the retrograde to work out, figure out what happened, figure out how to fix that in the future. Just an interesting thing to notice right as Mercury enters the shadow of its retrograde and its relationship with Uranus over the course of this retrograde. One of the big stories of this upcoming week is going to be Mercury entering Virgo. And why I think that this piece is really important to be paying attention to is because we are now in the second half of the lunar month, the waning half, where we're trying to figure out what happened in the first half and what does it mean and how do we put all the pieces together, right? We had this big culmination, which showed up really interesting politically. A couple big things, right? The assassination attempt and Biden stepping down. So these big culminations and things which Mercury's trying to work out. The next lunar month that begins with the Leo new moon on August 4th is also the day that Mercury stations retrograde. So we have a lunar month that coincides with Mercury retrograde. And what that means is that entire lunar month, from August 4th until the Virgo new moon on September 2nd, will be colored by the Mercury retrograde and figuring things out. I think collectively we'll see this in, right? Everybody's talking about how we don't know because we don't have a precedent of what it means for the presumptive nominee to step down at this point in a campaign. We'll have the Democratic National Convention happen over the course of that month. So we'll be working on all of that. But in individual charts, right, this will mean that this big tone, this kind of tone shift of Mercury stationing retrograde in Virgo, in its own sign, in the sign of its exaltation, really rearranging the pieces, will have a big shift. And then that Virgo new moon that resets it, even though Mercury will station direct on August 28th, it'll still be in the post shadow of its retrograde until September 11th. And that Virgo new moon is Mercury's sign. So again, Mercury is doing this process of going over all of this stuff again. And then we are going to have the annual new moon in Virgo ruled by Mercury. So there is this desire to go back, comb through the details, and then maybe erase our work and start over. Virgo, one of the key struggles of Virgo is the desire to erase and start over so that things can be perfect. And one of the hardest things about being in the world is that you can't do that. Obviously, giving yourself the grace and the forgiveness, but forgiving is not forgetting, and there's no way to go back in time so that we can do things perfectly. And that, I think, is one of the biggest heartbreaks and one of the biggest challenges for Virgo spaces and Virgoan people is moving on with things when we didn't quite get them 100% right. And so I think we will be feeling that moving into Virgoan spaces. And this even builds us up because that Virgo new moon will be the last uneclipsed lunation for a month and a half. That Virgo new moon will be followed by our first Pisces eclipse on September 17th at 25 degrees of Pisces, followed by our second Libra solar eclipse on October 2nd. So we're back into eclipse season. I know I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but it does feel like the fall comes quickly and breaks harshly like a big wave. And we will be seeing that and feeling that politically in the divisiveness of all of this. That Pisces eclipse is going to happen close to Neptune. Neptune is at the end, really, of its time in Pisces. So we're feeling these culminations pretty potently, and it feels the inertia is picking up that's going to pull us into the fall, through the fall, and into the absolutely wild astrology of 2025 and really the rest of the decade. Did I accelerate too fast? Maybe. But this is what we're talking about in terms of everything happening and really the vista that we get of the sun opposite Pluto, because that aspect which perfects today, the sun entering its own sign and immediately running into that great big mirror of Pluto. And what happens when the sun is reflected by Pluto? One of my favorite metaphors for Pluto and its relationship to the sun is that, or I guess this is more of a parable. One of my favorite parables is that if you were standing on Pluto, the sun wouldn't look like the sun. It would look like a particularly bright star. And when we join the Plutonian perspective of things, when we look at ourselves from a Plutonian perspective, suddenly we're not that powerful. We're not that special. We're not the center of everything. And that can be destabilizing to the solar purpose, the sense of consistency and stamina and identity inherent in the sun that gives us this feeling of being alive and fills us with the inherent power and pleasure of being alive and being ourselves in the world. Pluto has a tendency to negate that, not out of direct refutation, but showing us our true proportion in the context of everything else, and especially in Aquarius. And this can be particularly unsettling in Leo, that's asking us to be in our authenticity, and you cannot be authentic if you cannot feel yourself. And Aquarius asks, what should I be in the world? What does the world need from me? There's a utilitarian purpose to identity fulfillment within the Aquarian context, that the sun in Leo that's embedded in the spectacular now, it cuts it off at the knees. And so there is an identity crisis and a moment of, who are we? What are we doing? And this real kind of checking what the project is. As we move through the week, on Tuesday, the moon moves into Pisces. That, I think, is going to allow us to feel all of this. We can get the emotional hit from what's been happening. And then by Thursday, the moon moves into Aries and Mercury moves into Virgo. So again, we think we have a better handle on things. We can technically figure things out more, but it's stuff that we are going to have to reprocess and re-go over. We get a kind of boost from later on Thursday, when the sun in Leo sextiles Mars in Gemini. We get a kind of stamina from that will help pick the sun up after its opposition with Pluto, but it might get a little frenetic, as it is likely to. Friday sees the retrograde station of Chiron in Aries at 23 degrees. That can bring up old wounds, especially if it's aspecting your natal Chiron, right? And Chiron in Aries has been wounds around the self, and Chiron stationing retrograde in Aries is stationing retrograde at around the degrees of some of our eclipses that have been happening there. So it might pull us back into those storylines, into those pieces, and connect us with our vulnerability in a way that can be a little bit frustrating. It's going to hit home immediately because the moon is right behind it. And so the moon is conjoining Chiron as this is happening, and the moon brings things close and makes them personal. So this is one that's not likely to take a few delays. If you're going to feel it, it is going to happen right then. Saturday, the moon goes into Taurus, and we move into the final week of the lunar month. So this is my favorite week, the wind down week, the relax week, the finish things up, the tie up loose ends, but really, if you can, rest. This is the rest week, the feeling settled in to things. This is a week to eat peaches. I am very excited to be headed back to Colorado, where there are amazing peaches, and to eat them as a sacred ritual, remembering this moment in time and savoring it as just one breath of a nearly eternal universe doing its thing in one moment, and a big way that we improve the spirit of the world is to enjoy being in it. There's lots of suffering. We do what we can, but suffering in solidarity doesn't necessarily make things better. Rather than climbing down into a sense of helplessness with other people, we will slowly drop down from there towards a Leo new moon on August 4th, which is also the day that Mercury will station retrograde in Virgo and that Venus will enter Virgo, and it will be a very different feel as we work through this. Humble beginnings, grassroots movements. So let's do what we can this week. Rest as we sink down towards a new moon and begin the work of the retrograde time, going over and refashioning what we need to, resting as we start building towards Mars conjunction with Jupiter on August 14th and square with Saturn on the 15th. And that's what we have. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. And we're all in this together in some ways. I will see you next time. Best of luck.